All right. Thanks everyone for joining today's session of the Space Syntax Lab seminars. I'm excited to welcome Daniel Koch and Anne Legeby, whose work will be very familiar to many of you. Today, Daniel and Anne will discuss from a syntactical perspective how design and research can better incorporate inclusiveness in their practice using the example of Uppsala in Sweden. Daniel Koch is a docent in architecture and a researcher at the KTH School of Architecture in Stockholm, Sweden. He's also co-director of the cross-disciplinary master's program in sustainable urban planning and design. His research focuses on examining the relationship between architectural space, social structures, and subjects of becoming on a wide range of scales. He engages with challenges of difference and specificity in spatial analysis and is building towards a research profile of critical morphology. His recent research as part of the Sensible Stockholm Lab focused on the socioeconomic effects of urban developments over time and how digitalization is affecting rural areas in the context of global climate change and equality, among others. Anne Legeby is professor in applied urban design, also at the KTH School of Architecture. Her research concerns society-space relations and focuses on increasing the understanding of the role of architecture in relation to social segregation and unequal living conditions. She employs urban analysis and develops methodologies and theories to analyze, model, and visualize urban form, defined by architecture and urban design, and how this relates to urban processes. She conducts several of her research projects in close collaboration with public actors. And in addition to her research activities, Anne is also teaching urban design and planning at the KTH and other universities. I think Daniel and Anne's research constitutes an important contribution to the field, which is why I'm very excited to hear more about this and look forward to an engaging and informative seminar. And before we start, I should mention we will have a Q&A at the very end. So if you have any questions during the talk, please post them in the chat so that we can address these at the very end of the presentation. And with this, I'd like to hand over to you, Daniel and Anne.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll start by sharing my screen with you. So 35 to 45 minutes is what we had, I think. So that's what we're targeting. And we're going to talk about the center of the talk is going to be about a project we did in Uppsala, trying to incorporate urban universal design into syntactical analysis in various ways. This is a project that went for 2 years, funded by Vinnova in a framework of universal design funding, where we acted as project lead at KTH in cooperation with Uppsala municipality and 2 disability rights organizations, one for the municipality and one in the region, which were fundamental because they are the ones making sure that what we say have purchase on their challenges and their understanding. And the municipality also financed part of it. So what we're trying to do in the project is to investigate system effects of differences in accessibility in the physical environment, where the main question concerns accessibility to social system services. We try to apply an intersectional perspective. I'll get back to that a little bit. And accessibility is understood relationally. It appears in the relation between individual and environment. So this is the structure of the talk. We will spend most of the time, hopefully, on the Uppsala study. So if it goes very quick in the beginning, don't worry. That's because this is background. And I think a fair amount of what we bring up in the beginning is going to be familiar, maybe said in a different way. Some of it will just tweak familiar understandings to make it work, right? But this is also so you can see where we're heading with the study and what's going to happen, right?
Sorry, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
We can't do it in the Zoom.
Still? Can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
Yeah.
I think those that have difficulties to hear might need to re-log in to Zoom and sort technical problems on their end.
Thank you. Like I said, it will go quick for the parts that are not the Uppsala study and the concluding considerations, but this is we're also maybe more going to tell a story of this rather than going really in depth in the nitty-gritty, because we don't have time for that, right? So, conceptual basis, an outline of affordances and differences. Like many in the fields do today, in this field, space syntax do today. I mean, we work with affordances as project as the concept for why syntactic analysis and how syntactic analysis matters in many ways. Affordances that comes from Gibson as an idea of how it is the relation between a being, a species, and its environment that defines how defines affordances. And similarly, we argue that accessibility is not existing anywhere. It only exists in a relation between, for instance, people and the environment. Where Gibson, of course, also brings in things like it's not only like the structure and the environment, but also what you need from the environment, what is dangerous in the environment, and so on. But the idea is that depending on the faculties of the being and the conditions of the environment and the dangers and positives of the environment and so on, these affordances will look very different. Where Gibson mostly stays on the species level, and arguably most of syntactic level research also stays on the species level, talking about this as a general concept of how people and environment relate. But relate differently to the environment. And what's accessible or inaccessible for some might be accessible or inaccessible for others, and so on. And this is not only between different people, it changes over time. So stairs, for instance, can when we're born in the first years, they're an obstacle. It's something that we cannot get past. Then it becomes fun to climb in as such. So it's a sort of like a playground. Then we start to see that, oh, hey, there's something beyond the stair. So a stair rather becomes a sign of adventure. There is something where there is new stuff happening. So it becomes exciting just to go to the other end of the stairs. Then they become like utility, and then maybe later in life for they might become challenging or difficult or an obstacle, or even down to being downright inaccessible again, as one way of describing journeys of also changing accessibilities over life. All of these differences arguably then creates different affordances for different people. One way to show that in a very stylistic example of urban environment is this. We have a bus stop A to the left and a museum B to the right, with the shortest walking path looking like that. Now, if we can't, for instance, for somebody who cannot go through a stair, that would mean the shortest path turns into that in this case. If you also cannot walk past cobbles, maybe if you cannot pass unsupervised unsupervised crossings but can pass stairs, then this would be the shortest path. If you cannot pass stairs or supervised crossings, this would be the shortest path, and so on. So depending on combinations also, there are many different shortest paths possible, where also the subpaths might shift depending on how this plays out. But this is the problem in sort of a single A to B distance that we're talking about here, how differences in where we can move and not, and how we can orient, actually can create rather large differences in terms of distances and accessibility. Now, before moving into our project, we just want to sort of give a little bit more of a background, and we'll do this with very particular references, and fully accepting that there will be people that we forget to reference. But the argument here, of course, to a large extent relates to Richard Küller's ideas of molecular and molar accessibility, where molecular is the very local particular, whereas the molar is sort of the whole environment, the whole life environment accessibility. It's to some extent a scale question, but also a question of difference in particularity. And our argument is that syntactic analysis very much is about translations between molecular and molar levels. It's basically sort of configuration of molecular level leading to molar results. But also that we could offer quite a lot to universal design research in that particular translation, because if we look at that research, it's very strong on the molecular level. On the molar level, it's still struggling to be working with descriptions of wholes and so on. And then we have the person environment occupation model, which is built on the Gibson's affordance model, and more or less does the translation that we are also doing, saying, well, yeah, okay, species level, but we can also understand this on the individual level with individual differences and so on. It's a little bit more complex, but this is where we sort of slot into urban universal design research. We also have, of course, some precedents in space syntax research. Teresa Haytor and others who did an inaccessibility campus research study a number of years ago, 10 years ago now, actually, studying how different barriers and different accessibilities affects accessibilities in campuses. And then we have Julian Hansen's study of the inclusive city. From these, in relation to these, we can then see how we understand two concepts that are important: barriers and enablers. Barriers working a little bit like described in this simplified image, where we see one system to the left with two locations, for instance, A and B, and another system to the right, where the only difference is the small things marked in gray on the left-hand system. And we can see how centrality, this happens to be integration or closeness centrality, measures in number of turns, thicker lines describing more central. And we can see that location A and B are equally central in one and very, very differently central in the other. And these are the kinds of effects we're looking for in our study, because it could be that the grayed areas are, for instance, cobbles, unsupervised crossings, stairs, or something else that blocks for some people, but not for others. Enablers works a little bit like this. Julienne's example is primarily public toilets, where she argues that it's not about that you need to go to the toilet all the time. She speaks about many who, when they grow older, needs to. It's that if you have to, you would have to go quickly, which means that having a toilet close by, a public toilet close by, defines accessibility. But as long as you have one close by continuously, you can basically move through the entire city quite far. So these points actually creates a system, and any small break in that point system, that accessibility system actually cuts off parts of the city. From this, of course, we also bring in studies or methodologies and concepts from our own earlier research, starting, for instance, with the notion, which we will be working heavily with, of changing and comparing different models, which started as a research into resilience against terrorist attacks, actually, then moved into together with S. and Amshirini, we studied it on urban levels in relation to rivers and bridges and river cities and so on, and the resilience of cities. So it's the same methodology, or it's a development of that notion of we need to understand what happens if we change things and what that means, that now is translated to, well, what if we look at it as differences in the existing environment? Another strand that, of course, is important going into this is this notion of equality, justice, access to resources, and access to social services, and so on. That we have a long sort of, especially through Anna, very long and solid work in sort of developing that and that they are sort of brought together also in this project in terms of what happens if we look at it from this point of view. So with that background, we did move into this in a prototypical study, and here's also where we maybe should introduce this sort of what's intersectional in a way. Intersectional in a simple way, it comes from studies, it's Kimberly Crenshaw, it deals with racism and class and so on, which is important to note. But the concept is that we cannot study individual differences or individual acts of segregation or similar. We need to also understand how combinations of factors play in. So for instance, being in Crenshaw's example, being black and being a woman, and then being black and woman are three different conditions, because the combination might be different than either of the other combinations. And all of us, then she says, are many of these things. So we did a test of this, right? In another project in interactive platform for social system services in urban planning in Uppsala Väsby. And let's not go into why we ended up with two factors that had different characters, which we were happy with. So it's tunnels and it's the lit street system. And then we decided to look at what happens with centrality if we look at the system in general, the lit street system, and the system without tunnels to begin with, right? And then what if we combine lit street system that cannot pass through tunnels? I hope that is clear. So in general, it looks like this, the standard model, and this is the smog model of Stockholm we've been using. So it's angular integration global scaling that we see running through here on a segment map. And if we were to look at only the lit system, it looks like this. If we very much simplify it, what happens is that we have a centrality that looks somewhat like that then shrinks in this way. If we instead remove all the tunnels, the system would look like this. That is, compared to the standard model, instead we see a complete shift of centrality to the south half of the municipality. Thirdly, now the important thing when it comes to intersectionality, if we combine these two, we see this pattern, and what happens is actually that it splits up into three different centralities, still doing the global integration analysis on all of this. So this is also where we can say that actually the amount of change is not necessarily directly related to the amount of system change is not directly related to the amount of let's say meters of street that is changing, right? Because there's more difference in the lit system than there is in the tunnels because they are only a few meters long, each of them. But the changes that removing the tunnels bring in are more important, and the combination then becomes a third. So this was a prototypical study saying, yeah, this is important. Then we moved into this project, right? So this project, we should, to give a little bit of what we did, also to say what it was a little bit more. We did, aside from doing this, Björn Hellström was involved also, then adjunct professor at KTH. So we worked, in addition to what we're going to talk about today, there was a big package that concerned governance and policy, and how you would lead work with universal design within municipal organizations and so on, which then also, of course, touched on how would you work with this in terms of spatial analysis, statistics, but also in terms of what competences do you allow to take place and how do you work with them? And how do you make sure that people are enabled to work with this? And how do you ensure that competences are acknowledged and can grow and so on? And yes, it's a complex project involving all of these actors, but it was a very integrated study. I think it was on a positive sort of size in terms of complexity compared to sort of not breaking apart into too much. A number of actors was a very sort of solid group with very engaged partners from Uppsala municipality and municipal partners. Having said that, let's move into the studies, and I'm going to have a move to Anne now to introduce the first studies of enablers.
Yes, to walk, you need to be able to sit. One of these studies we did as part of the project was to study enablers, and drawing from ideas about accessibility and walkable cities that also should be inclusive. We focused on how benches may function as enablers. This is also something that the city of Uppsala has worked with very strategically, why it was relevant in this project. The Swedish planning legislation has a long history of promoting accessibility for all, something that today is discussed more in terms of universal design. And it has these very important legislation that should be in action, but it's not, unfortunately. In addition to the national legislation, the city of Uppsala has ambitious goals and several action plans that addresses the situation for elderly, as well as for people with impaired mobility. And they argue to walk, you need to be able to sit. The bench is here in a Julian Hansen perspective, a typical example of an enabler. And the city of Uppsala has specific policy saying that the distance between benches should be 50 meters where many elderly live, 50 to 100 meters where there are important goal points in the city, and 100 to 200 meters along pedestrian paths in general. And as you see, this is a very ambitious goal. On the map to the right, you may see that there is a concentration of elderly people in the red spots. However, we want to emphasize that this is not only relevant for elderly people. Many more are dependent on places to sit to be able to walk. We use a data set including all benches in the city. Remember, this data is not then collected with the aim to study accessibility or the situation for people who have difficulties to walk longer distances. Rather, this is collected to be able to maintain the benches in themselves. We use PST to analyze which bench had a bench friend within 50, 100, 150, 200 meters and so on. And the green points here in the maps have a bench friend within certain distances. From this map, we see that some benches are building up a system of accessible paths, distributing accessibility for people having difficulties to walk longer distances. So if we use Gibson's way of inventing new concepts, this could be described as walkable and restable paths. Coming back to modifying the model, in this image, the street segments that are provided with benches build up a walkable, restable system and have benches frequently. And these are highlighted. We see that the city turns out to be rather fragmented. Moreover, we can identify large areas that turn out to be bench deserts and not accessible for all. It illustrates in a very detailed way where in the city new benches would make a difference in terms of increasing accessibility and the walkability of the city. We were also interested in analyzing the conditions for each residential address point in the city. This analysis illustrates the distance from each residential address point to a system of connected benches. In this case, we chose benches within 100-meter distances. As we see, the situation today is that a large proportion of the address points have poor access to this walkable, restable paths in the city of Uppsala. And finally, since the city emphasizes the importance of accessibility to important functions and services in the city, we used a data set showing healthcare clinics in combination with these benches. It was revealed that only 6 out of 25 health clinics were connected to the paths provided with benches. And these types of analysis were also made for libraries as well as for municipal community centers. And then to the second study.
In the second study, we also did a questionnaire together with the disability rights organization. So the quotes here is from that questionnaire. One person said, uneven ground and blocking signs force you to make detours, which is also a way of introducing that if Anne was talking about enablers, now we're going to talk about barriers in various ways. And because barriers is even more complex to pull out of the digital data that exists, because there's basically not, Uppsala has very good data, they work very hard with it, actually compared to many municipalities in Sweden, and Sweden have very good data in general, but from this point of view, it's highly problematic. So instead of trying to pick out something from the data set, we did this questionnaire of asking people. It gave a lot of additional things that we will see. So we have done a questionnaire asking people to point out places which they find inaccessible and explain why. And then we will now use a pair of respondents concretely to illustrate what we have found. this is and now I'm just going to show, so it's differences like this. So they have different size, they are different locations, and they can be quite different, as you can see here now, just showing two different responses that I will be using. And the effects on the system can be quite different, but this is what we're talking about. So what happens when we look at that? Well, one, of course, important thing to look at that have been, studied before in various ways. For instance, I know you're here, Ermal, so what we can easily connect back to your floor plate shapes analysis, for instance, earlier when pillars suddenly interrupt systems and you see what happens. So what happens if sort of these inaccessibilities interrupt the system? Well, if we take one example, we can see how the global configuration, the integration core more or less look like this in Uppsala as it is now we're doing an axial line analysis for simplicity's sake. It looks like this, and then when we introduce one of these respondents inaccessibilities, it changes like this. And one thing I think that is important to highlight here is that this is not only about reducing accessibility or reducing integration, because integration is a relative measure, and we can see that, for instance, in these areas, integration actually increases. It sort of takes over the central role that was carried by other streets earlier, and especially there's one down on the right there. You can see there's a bend that starts to exist, a continuous bend of integration that didn't exist prior to these interruptions. So integration is not simply reduced, it is actually shifted around, which means that for some people, some streets are much more central than for other people, in a quite complex way. Because we can also see that a lot of areas directly lose integration in that sense. So this is as far as we came in the paper in a way, or what's included in the paper, more or less. In the reports and in the work, we have also done the next step of looking at a bit, what does this mean for accessibility to something, for instance, distance to grocery store in number of meters in the generic system, the way we usually analyze it in syntax. And we can see it's like this. Darker is going to be higher value, more for all of this. So we can see certain distances, and we can compare it in number of meters, generic. One respondent, you can see there are locations where the change is big and where it's small. Or we can look at it in terms of, for instance, let's see, so I remember, yeah. The alternative is to see how many services are within a certain distance. So we can look at, for instance, accessible services within 6 turns in the generic system, and a difference. And here we can see much more of a direct decrease in number of services being stores and cafes and restaurants and a lot of things like that, various services. The changes are definitely not uniform, but they can also be a little bit difficult to read, we see. And it is like that also because part of the differences get eaten up by the generic structures of accessibility. So some differences that are quite strong get lost simply when analyzing this. And it's also a question if we're analyzing difference or if we're analyzing what's accessible. So are we analyzing what people can reach? What do they have? What can they work with? Or are we analyzing how it is different from others, right? So we can also then, instead of looking at trying to flip between 2 images like this and say, well, what's the difference? How big is it? Where is it different? We can actually compare what's accessible compared to, for instance, I will keep referring to the generic system, right? Which is the generic system, meaning the way it's supposed to be drawn in by space syntax practice, right? Here's a map like that. So here's a difference in distance to libraries for respondent 17 versus a standard model from distance from address points. And we can see that there's quite large differences and they're not really super predictable. Black dots, by the way, means locations that do not have any library they can't really move around, basically. Whereas the gradients of yellow to orange, brown are increasing. Stronger color again means larger difference. So in some parts of the central city, it's really differently far to libraries in number of meters for one respondent, if they were to live on that address as compared to another respondent. If we instead look at number of turns, it's actually quite a big difference. So there are some parts of the central city where the number of meters shift a lot in terms of distance to closest library, but where the ease of orientation doesn't really change at all, and the other way around. So it might be a much longer way, but it's not more complex than it was before. And then, of course, for different individuals, one would be a bigger problem or a challenge or a difficulty than the other. And the effects, therefore, would be quite different. We can also compare, for instance, difference in accessible services again. So this is not the accessible services that you reach, but the difference in how many you reach. This is for respondent 17. So one respondent, and we can see how it spreads all over the city, and it actually grows as strongest down in the southwest and in the south. Whereas for another respondent, it has a different pattern. It's still a difference in the southwest and south, but the difference is higher in the central city and up towards the northeast and so on. So these are the ways that we can start to unearth through these analyses complexities in accessibility and what it actually means. That coming back to that very simple difference, I mean, we could talk about some of these things could be things like cobblestones or pavement that is too uneven to walk on for a few meters, or a small stair or something like that cause these kinds of large effects, or one missing bench that breaks the chain, or things like that could be small, or they could be large. So trying to wrap up now, I think we're actually doing quite fine on time, but I will not talk very long here still, but we're doing quite fine on what we want to say by this, and of course please ask questions about particulars later if you want to. But so one thing we want to stress is that affordances need to be understood both as enablers and barriers, which may correspond quite well to Gibson's own terminology of positive and negative affordances. It's already there in Gibson's work, even though the so-called positive affordances are usually the ones that are mostly brought forward as compared to the negative, although like in some sense, spatial configuration are always both at the same time. You could argue that we create accessibilities, but we also create inaccessibilities when we build a building, for instance. So we define both positive and negative affordances, but barriers then would more be like negative affordances when you speak of differences, whereas benches would be more like positive affordances, and so on. The challenge is complex, so the answer is complex. Data challenges are important to recognize. Like one of the reasons we used benches was because they had worked with it and therefore also had it very much in their system. Whereas they had a lot of data on, for instance, paving, but that was updated as they worked. So it was quite easy to find particular segments of streets that were paved in a way that many would find inaccessible, but it was not stored as cobbled, for instance. So and this is not complaining to Uppsala, it's just we need to also realize that keeping all of this up to date takes a lot of work. They also had data on every single stair in public space. What they didn't have data on that was easy to use was whether you had to walk through that stair or if there was a ramp or a path or an incline next to the stair, so you actually could just pass on, next by or something like that. So even though there's really good data, sometimes it's not necessarily used, gathered for this particular purpose, and then it might be problematic. But on the other hand, we should also stress there's no way we could understand these complexities without these digital tools and this data and this work. So we need to balance that. The challenge of actually that data is not gathered for these purposes and that there's so much data we might have to need with what we can unearth. And we think maybe that in this kind of work, very much is understanding patterns of change rather than particular things. And let's not talk about that, but we did see some patterns of change in Uppsala also, places that were more sensitive for things and places that were less sensitive for differentiations. We can show that small local differences can make radical system difference, and large differences can have small impact, and this is one of the important knowledges we can get from this way of working, because arguably in many cases it's the system change that is really important, but not always when it comes to how do we help creating an even and as equal possibility and accessibility as possible. But complexity also concerns differences. There are both converging and conflicting challenges and solutions, and I'll get a little bit more into that. This must inform both analysis and urban environment ideas. But syntax can, and this is what we want to stress also, because syntax is a very fine-grained understanding of spatial differentiations, which means that it can help work with uninclusive complexity within navigable networks, as, for instance, area-based research cannot do if we work with the complexity that the syntax tools offer and accept that actually, hey, there are many more ranges than, for instance, the most vibrant street that offers contributions. So a few quotes to illustrate what we're going to complete with the event. So for instance, here's a challenge. A quote, these are quotes directly from the questionnaire. So St. Erik's Torre, the whole area around the square and the cathedral museum, etc. It's so much cobblestone, it doesn't work for my body. You can almost feel the sort of frustration here. And when you go in and look at this area that is sort of written off as inaccessible, you can see that actually moving through that compared to other places that this person has not mentioned would be possible. But because there's enough that is too bothersome to work with, the entire area is written off as inaccessible. So sometimes it's not only about the particular streets or locations, but collections of locations can ascribe, metonymically ascribe character to whole areas, which then works recursively. So when the whole area is ascribed to being inaccessible, it writes back to every location in the area as being inaccessible, cognitively speaking, for this person. Another quote is that it has been difficult to move about in an electric wheelchair, but I discovered today that it was even in good, which was such an important quote in many ways in this project to realize. It says basically that, of course, people doesn't go to each street they cannot access today and couldn't access yesterday and look today if they can access it. You don't go to where you don't think you have access. So things might be fixed for years and years and people don't know. And this, of course, has general purchase on how we consider the link between cognition and behavior and space, material space, because, of course, this is true for everyone. We don't go everywhere in the city all the time, updating our view of the city. So our cognitive maps are always containing various degrees of up-to-date and non-up-to-date information. A third, which I think also is important for us as a field, because yes, we work and we want to work with that. We all like, I would argue, lively environments. So this is not an argument against that. But this quote, I get deep anxiety from all the people who won't follow rules, is a quote that we've picked because there were quite a few people that pointed to some of the success stories, so to speak, in Uppsala municipal planning, because they had really managed to create lively, vibrant places with people moving most all over the place most of the time. And for some people, they were horrendous. They would never go there, they avoid them, and so on. So by creating the kind of situations we want, we might actually exclude people. One other key that had to do with this is what one of our partners called exitability. So another quote we could have used, but it's not included here, is this: that many of those who dislike very chaotic environments or very sort of environments full of people that need to be alone, particularly dislike shopping centers because they feel they cannot get out. So they might prefer the inner city because you can get out of a store easily and backstreet is close by. Whereas in a shopping mall is more or less designed to keep you within it and making going out a little bit of a challenge and so on. But this also speaks of, if we want inclusive, vibrant environments, they need to be integrated with backstreets, pockets, oases, or whatever that allow people to have a breather from it. And this, because there might be panic attacks. And if you don't feel, we could compare this with the enabler study. If we don't have enough pockets, enough easily accessible in a vibrant system, the whole system just becomes inaccessible for some, right? So this is really concluding now, bringing this back additionally to challenges and information for syntax studies as a whole. This brings out some things. I mean, we know some of this, but it stresses some things also, that cognition is complex. Spatial cognition is complex. It's a patchwork of individual experience and social agreements, of updated information and information from long ago. Particular locations can stand for whole areas, and locations can be ascribed conditions from their context or parallels. I'll get back to the social part in a moment. And what we do in syntax is we create system analysis. This is using Habermas terms, life world and system world. And the syntax, the model study is always a system study. And we talk about it often as the lived and experienced world, but literally what we're doing, which is very fruitful, and I would say one of the points and really strong parts of syntax, is that we actually try to create a system model of the material world, because we model material boundaries. A system model of the material world that is directly relevant for the life world of people. But we don't model the life world, and we cannot model the life world because the life world is always particular and individual, collective, social, and all of these things, and can change over time. But what we try to understand is what the material world does to the life world of people. And in this way, the models we use are really powerful in bridging these sort of systems of GIS data and systems analysis, configurative analysis, centralities, and so on, in a way that actually has purchase on how people perceive and live in their environment. The life world, which is the one we would argue constructs, is that's where affordances live or reside, relates to the material world, cognition, and action, both socially and individually. We can see that places that are reported as inaccessible are generally places that have high accessibility for most. So central places are much more likely to be reported as inaccessible than peripheral places or segregated places. So inaccessible for everyone, kind of, then if the accessibility is not different, perceived as the amount of difference in accessibility is perceived, which speaks of that, cognitively speaking, people are aware of both shared or others' accessibility and their own accessibility, speaking of at least two cognitive layers of spatial understanding, probably more. We have multiple maps. At the very least, there seems to be a differentiation between general patterns and my possibilities. But there also seems to be, this is very preliminary, what I'm going to say now, but there seems to be a tendency towards convergence to fewer maps, right? Than just, so it's not, we're not arguing for one map for every person as a sort of modeling technique, but we're arguing for that actually there are maps that highlight important differences, but also because spatial cognition is both individual and social, some of these differences might actually start to converge. So if I have difficulties with that location and you have difficulties with that location, they're slightly differently difficult, we might just start to agree over time. Now, to finalize, we want to say that now we work with disability rights organizations, and that was important and good. It's great to have their knowledge, and also that they can validate the approach with saying, this is important for us, please, this is very, yes, go on, this is telling this and this and this. So we could validate the approach in that way. But we will also would like to say that the differences can be of many kinds. They could be sociocultural, as in Aguiar Suzuki's discussions. It could be class differentiation, safety concerns, or other reasons why some people wouldn't go to a certain place and thereby leave it out of their cognitive maps. It could be between species, like Metaberg-House-Pont and others have done a map of bee accessibility and so on. Of importance is that in order to work with diversity, arguably, we must investigate how to actively use different models in addition to different measures. We have used quite a lot of different measures in syntax research, but arguably not so much investigations into what different models mean. And if we speak of the life world of people, the models, the cognitive models we're talking about are different. Thank you.